Peace, everybody. It's good to be here with y'all. It's good to be back with the Black Sustainability Summit. My name's Noah McDonald, and I'm the Research and Landwork Coordinator at Southeast African American Farmers Organic Network. This is pre-recorded, so bear with me if there's a little bit of stumbling or just figuring things out. This is my first time doing this, but I'm really excited to share with y'all this subject matter and my work at SAAFON and SAAFON's work at large. So we're going to be talking about reviewing material from a report released earlier this year called Growing the Legacy, Stewarding a Black Agrarian Revival in the Rural South. You can find the text online at saafon.org. It's right up here, SAAFON.org. But yeah, like I said, it's really good to be here. And I hope that this is really generative and good learning. So yeah. Just want to open with this quote. That's kind of the basis for what we're going to jump into this session. The land is the key to our life. This is a quote from Sarah Reynolds Green, SAAFON member, Marshview Community Farm in St. Helena Island, South Carolina. And that is a picture of part of the farm. Just want to pause and feel and remember that we cannot be alive without the land, and we cannot be healthy without the land. We can't exist as human beings without the land. One of the few fundamental truths of what it means to be a human, or even to just be alive. Just want to start with that. So today, like I said earlier, we're reviewing the report. So this presentation is going to focus on these 4 areas as outlined in the report: an introduction to SAAFON, an introduction to the SAAFON's Black Land Tenure Project, and an overview of land loss and Black agrarianism, and looking at strategies for how to bring about or facilitate a Black agrarian revival. Really exciting stuff, that last piece. So just as an introduction to SAAFON, so SAAFON is the first and only organization in the United States dedicated to assisting organic and sustainable Black farmers. It was founded in 2006 by Cynthia Hayes and Dr. Owusu Bandele, originally to assist Black farmers in the Southeast in attaining organic certifications. Back then, during the time organics as a market was like really taking off, and a lot of Black farmers were already farming without the use of chemicals, or especially farming without the use of pesticides. And so it was just a logical transition for a lot of Black farmers to facilitate becoming organic certified, get the price premium. But yeah, it's kind of 4 strips of cloth, so to speak, in the quilt SAAFON: the staff, the farmer membership, the board, and the land. And we kind of all are woven together to really help to bring about prosperity for Black farmers in the rural South. There's a little bit of a mixture between the two. Between the 3, really, many of the staff are farmers in and of themselves. Many of the board at SAAFON are also farmers in and of themselves. And so it's really a lot of synergy there. And yeah, the land is always with us, so, and has deep influence on what we do. It's just a picture of one of our most recent gatherings, kind of right before COVID hit. SAAFON, these are the Mississippi farmer members, some of them, at an agroecology encounter that was held at Bowie Land Trust in Brookhaven. It's one of our board members, Mr. Jesse Bowie. So you got the youngins up in the mix. It's important. So to talk a little bit about, to really get into things and really talk about this SAAFON's Black Land Tenure Project and how it came about, originally there was obviously the largest civil rights lawsuit in the United States, which was Pigford versus Glickman, a group of Black farmers. I'm sure most folks are familiar, but if you're not, it's a group of Black farmers in the early 90s actually came together to collectively sue the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, for systemic discrimination against Black farmers. And after a relatively lengthy legal battle, they basically won. There's a lot of nuance around what won means, but there was a large sum of money as restitution awarded to Black farmers, but some of it was not dispersed for a number of reasons. Many farmers were elders and they had passed on during the legal deliberations, or some didn't come forward to claim. So there was something called a SAAFON fund that was created by a judge. And SAAFON applied for funds to start a project to ensure land retention within its network and hopefully be able to scale that project and make it applicable to Black farmers throughout the Southeast. So that's kind of the origin of the project. That was 4 years ago at this point. And we've moved pretty far since then. But really, I just want to highlight the interviews. So the interviews was really a core, crucial part of the project, so we designed questionnaires for a lot of elder and legacy farmer members. Pretty much every single one we interviewed specifically because they were farming family land. Oftentimes land had been in the family for 100 years, sometimes since the 1880s in many cases, and 1870s, so pretty close to emancipation. And additionally, we also solicited interviews at 2018 Black Urban Farmers and Growers Conference, which at that time was in Durham, North Carolina. So really wanted to get a cross-generational view around views of land retention, land transmission. And yeah, then we've drafted a report, which I spoke about earlier, which basically sharing the contents that report out now with y'all. So these are kind of the essential questions that came out of the Black Land Tenure Project that really we're still grappling with. And I think these set of questions are really helpful for anyone who is really interested in assisting Black farmers in retaining land, or interested in general in interrupting the trend of land loss in the United States with Black folk. And also, I just think anyone interested. So these are kind of the core questions that the report sought to answer. So I'll just read them out. How do African Americans retain land through cultural strategies? How is the project of remembering tied to the interruption of land loss and revival of Black agrarianism? What can SAAFON members teach us about intergenerational land work and its ability to prevent land loss? How does the next generation look at the land? What challenges are they having? What do they want to see? And how can SAAFON ensure successful farm and land succession in our network by activating cultural strategies. It's really this cultural piece is coming forward. So before we dive into things, it's like, let's figure out if we're on the same page. Like, what is Black land loss? What is Black agrarianism? So to start, Black land loss is, I think, has really taken the front seat in terms of visibility compared to, I would say, in the 20s or in the 80s when it was at its height. We're really all familiar with a lot of media stories around Black families having their land seized from them because of development, resort development on the coast, even military installations, suburbanization, and obviously also being targeted for sale by timber companies and neighboring white farmers, and also corporate farms are many other examples. And land ownership as it stands today amongst Black Americans is lower than it was during Reconstruction. Some estimates differ, but a lot of folks say we're between around 2 to 4 million acres of land owned. So these kind of statistics are, I hope they're not new because they have been popularized recently, but what I really want to focus on is like this concept of Black agrarianism. Because really, like it says here on the slide, Black land loss is the loss of access to the land, so ownership of the land. But Black agrarianism isn't specifically naming the knowledges, wisdoms, practices, and technologies that are being lost because of land loss. So I think of it in terms, Black agrarianism is a body or a cultural body, and Black land loss is a symptom of a greater disease that is infecting the body of Black agrarianism. And Black agrarianism has a life of its own. It's a cultural tradition, kind of using it similarly as many folks like use the Black radical tradition. I would say this is kind of the counterpart to that within agriculture and farming. So I will really show y'all a quote that I think kind of epitomizes the ethic and the feeling behind Black agrarianism. We feel it to be very important that we obtain homes, owning our shelters, and the ground, that we may raise fruit trees, concerning which our children can say, these are ours. Committee of the Colored People of Halls Hill and the vicinity, Falls Church, Virginia. Letter to the Freedmen's Bureau, 1865. So here, I'm not going to dissect this quote for y'all, but we do see how essential intergenerational transmission of land is, and creating home and belonging for your children. It really says it all here. I love this quote. So I'll just share a little bit about a timeline of Black agrarianism, just for some further contextualization of what I mean by wisdoms, technologies, cultural practices, and knowledge bases. So I actually would start with the beginning, the roots of Black agrarianism, which is the kinship-based commons in pre-colonial West and Central Africa. So this phrase, the kinship-based commons, was originally coined by Dr. Savvy Horn of Land Loss Prevention Project in Durham, North Carolina. And it's really attempting to describe how pre-colonial indigenous West and Central Africans related to the land. And then this is in no way negating the continuation of this practice. This practice is definitely still continuing all across Africa. And essentially, the two pieces of focus on is an eco-spiritual worldview and practice, and the fact that a lineage belonged to a land and a land belonged to a lineage. So, a lot of people will claim that private ownership did not exist. It's a little bit more complicated, but most of the time, a lineage has claim over a specific area of land, and that lineage is tied to the original founder who founded the community and founded the lineage. And council of elders or single elder will kind of extend use to specific members of the lineage based on their ranking and age, or even economic ranking within the lineage. And the land use decisions and land management decisions were governed through a spiritual or what Western anthropologists call animist worldview. So really like actually communicating with deities and spirits, and communicating with non-humans. So communicating with like rivers and trees and things, and making sure not to upset the ecological balance. It's really the foundation. So I just want to name those two things as the foundation of Black agrarianism. And those two things being adapted post-Middle Passage. And so plantation and marronage lasted for a very long time. You see here 1525 to 1865, where Africans were stolen and owned people on a stolen and owned land. And so the ownership piece is attempting to kind of articulate the fact that a single person or a group of people could have complete and utter power over any decisions about the lives of all the humans and non-humans in a specific place, and have a government back it up. It's very distinct innovation of colonization, I would say. And Africans were put into the plantations, and saying the plantation as a total institution to kind of encapsulate that they were schools, and schools of forced assimilation, cultural assimilation, religious assimilation. They were also businesses. So they were generating profits for the owners, and they were also, in a sense, also prisons and concentration camps. So really just bringing forward that what it would be like to have been brought from a kinship-based commons societies into that total institution. And yeah, we're all familiar with the pain from that. But kind of as a counterbalance to the plantation, existed this concept of marronage, a French word, but people have talked about like the Maroons. The Jamaican Maroons are pretty famous, but there's also widespread marronage in the United States, and many of which was actually a continuation of the kinship-based commons. So I'll shout out to the Afro-Seminoles, Afro-Seminole communities in Florida and also in Texas and Mexico, were very much a continuation of the kinship-based commons. And so after freedom, or during freedom, this was kind of the transition from Africans to now African-American, being a citizen, now having legal status as a human being. And also this piece on Black utopias, the founding of free people's communities all throughout the South, all throughout the United States, but particularly the South and the Midwest. So folks have heard of like the Exodusters, and in the South, there were just so many unnamed and named freedmen's communities in almost every county in the entire South, many of which, though they kind of revamped a lot of the qualities of the kinship-based commons to accommodate and to adapt and to survive in this really new territory that is freedom. And then Black populism in the DER is really a time period of white backlash to Black progress, self-determination. This is the famous 16 million acres of land were owned by Black people in the United States. During this time, there were mass agrarian organizations that were, had relative political power within particularly local and state governments throughout the Southeast. And you also have the emergence of Tuskegee and kind of like a Black agronomy with George Washington Carver and many of his students, and also many of the other Black agronomists who were working at Tuskegee during Carver's tenure. And after that period, Quadrupines and Great Migration. So you have kind of an intensification of economic violence with the crop lien system in the Great Depression, forced evictions and forced flight from the land is how I describe the Great Migration. And mass political organizing continued, but mainly through sharecroppers and pickers, not necessarily farm owners. And then the last period, it's the freedom movement, Southern freedom movement, and cooperative development. So this forced flight from the land is continuing, Great Migration is continuing. This time period is like the emergence of air property as a serious issue. And then also kind of in the lead here, you have the cooperative development movement as seeking to have economic independence and self-determination by the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and others such as New Communities. Sorry, that took a while, but that's one of my favorite parts. So getting into the interviews. So really the core of this project was like putting all of what I just talked about in a pot and then doing all these interviews with legacy members and young farmers, putting all that into a pot and cooking it up and really just seeing what we get out of it. And so I'll talk a little bit about the interviews. So out of the interviews, we're really able to identify 5 themes of Black agrarianism that we're also kind of corroborate with a lot of this historical research. So the 5 themes are kinship and community, protection, efficacy, nurturance, and service. So under each of those, there's just a little bit more. So under kinship and community, that's the foundation. We are stronger through connection in the commons. And protection, to protect the land and the people from being occupied and used by extractors. Efficacy, work the land in a way that creates a safe, secure, healthy living for yourself, your family, and your community. Nurturance, tend to cultivate and increase all that you have, knowledge and wisdom, your family and relations, and the produce of the land. Service, carry on and build upon the legacy and works of ancestors for the sake of the land and the yet to be born. So this is a quote by Mr. Ra again, that I think encapsulates and links back to the Freedman's quote. The ancestors had so much wisdom. They were future thinkers, forward thinkers. They had a gift for that, I feel. I think that was in the forefront of their mind. that I may have little, but I want my heirs and descendants to have more. And how can I do that? And what can I do now to make sure that they have that? And that was purchasing land, and they knew that purchasing land was valuable. That's just one of the many quotes from the interviews. You can find many quotes for each of those themes in the report itself at SAAFON.org. So really today we're faced with a lot of challenges, just like previous generations of Black farmers, agriculturalists, and agrarians had their own unique challenges. Our generation also has unique challenges, and these are the ones that I think we've identified as kind of some of the at the forefront of today. You know, where obviously global climate change is in a lot of people's minds right now, and awarenesses. The ability or efficacy of preventing a global meltdown depends on who you ask, but is very circumspect. And because of the influence of corporations and the billionaire class. But regardless of that, we're in the middle of a mass extinction. I believe it's the 6th mass extinction in Earth's history, and we're losing, a lot of people are focused that we're losing wild species, but we're also losing the diversity of domesticated species. We've definitely experienced increasing intensity of weather events this year and changes in climate pattern. And we're also seeing an increase in climate migration. There's been a lot of climate migration already just in the 21st century. Obviously, we've kind of seen an intensification of white violence. And, you know, there are many folk who say that there is a cycle in the US and, you know, there's a simmer and a boil, and it seems like we're kind of in a boil. Obviously, you have the pandemic, and I think the pandemic more than anything else has really exposed the weaknesses in supply chains of many industries, particularly food. And so we've definitely seen an increase in demand for food just on the local level. We're also in a generational shift. The average Black farmer is 62 years old, and only 6% of Black farmers are younger than 35. That's according to the USDA census, but still gives you an idea of where we're at in terms of generational investment in farming. The elders who they're not only the holders of land, but they're also the holders of tradition and knowledge and wisdom. They're continuing to transition. And we're also seeing just a very different way of living in terms of relationship to gender and also relationship to economic enterprise in these next generations. A lot of young people are not interested in, you know, commodity crop farming and even just building wealth at the expense of the land. And then obviously, like I said earlier, we're in very advanced stage of capitalism right now. There's a lot of monopolies over industries. There's a philanthropic control over movements for liberation. So, you know, people say non-profit industrial conflicts. And then there's also continuing public and private disinvestment in Southern Black communities, organizations, and associations. So given all these conditions and kind of given the tradition of Black agrarianism and also kind of what farmer members have proposed, we can begin to kind of outline some general strategies that exist and that have existed for reversing Black land loss. So I've kind of categorized them into four. There's organizational institutional landholding, so by NGOs such as land trusts, nonprofit organizations, community development corporations. This definitely has a really big precedent in the United States. Not necessarily amongst Black folks, but somewhat. There's new communities, Federation of Southern Cooperatives, the Nation of Islam, and some other organizations that I'm probably forgetting. And then there's obviously private enterprise. So that's individual ownership and entrepreneurialism. It's hard to pronounce. Cooperative land bases that are privately owned are definitely have always been a strategy since the very beginning of being here. Air property is actually a form of private ownership of land, even though it is split into multiple tenants within a piece of property. And then obviously also land and capital donations. I think those are becoming increasingly a thing that are occurring at this stage. And then obviously there's always government sponsored land reform. I think the United States is one of the more conservative places in the world for that, probably the most, if not the most conservative. There's only been one example of federal land reform there's been two examples of federal land reform, but for Black folks, there's only been one, which is obviously the famed 40 acres and a mule, Sherman's Field Order, and at the end of the Civil War, which granted 40 acres and an old army mule to a single Black head of household, a man, which was quickly revoked by President Andrew Johnson like 3 years later. But there's that. There's always been land reform for white settlers, though. Massively sponsored the Homestead Acts of 1862. If you're unfamiliar, look into it. But there's also state land reform. I'm not exactly familiar with what that's looked like. And then there's municipal land reform. So like municipal leasing of lands. I know this is like pretty popular in a lot of cities that are promoting urban agriculture, like Atlanta, New York City, the Bay, Los Angeles, and then like land banks, like Detroit. I know Detroit has these things are pretty active in Detroit. So these are another form of strategy. And then obviously kind of out extra legally, you have the squatters movements, marronage, and I put outcasting. MST in Brazil, I think is I can't speak Portuguese, but it's movimento sem terra, which means like movement without land. And it's probably the largest association of squatters, and they also advocate for government land reform. Probably in the world, they have thousands and thousands and thousands of members. They're highly organized. I really advise folk reading about them. And the second one is a squatters organization in South Africa. And also there's this hidden history of freedmen squatting as well, on vacant plantations during and after the Civil War, that people don't really know about. That I find it very fascinating. And then obviously there's the Maroons. So I just listed three of kind of the three largest examples in North America: Maroons, the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons, the Louisiana Maroons, and the Afro Seminoles. So those are the four strategies. Potentially they're a little uncreative. I'd be really interested to know if anybody else has any they think are that they don't see reflected in here. I'd love to hear that. So this is just a reflective exercise that you can do that I think is really important in, if you're thinking about purchasing land or working in Black land retention or starting a land-based project. So really just analyzing and reflecting on what are our relationships to the state, to capital, and to the land and water. And really, I really want to just for a second, dig into actually what those three things are. So I'm saying the state kind of as different than just saying government. I'm intentionally using that phrase to basically describe the complex of control that is instituted onto people. So, with that, it's important to review the relationship between the state and Black agrarianism, and also what our own personal and familial relationships to the state. And it's not always adversarial, or the state is not always trying to destroy families. For me, my family rose out of poverty because of the Great Society program by Lyndon B. Johnson. So, you've always been invested. Some elements of politicians have been invested in creating a middle class, for better, for worse. And then capital. So this is the richest piece, is what actually is money? What is capital, and how is capital a little different than money? And so I've kind of put this definition that capital, and this would apply to money, it's transmuted land and labor. That's what money is. It's like land, it's like a signifier of the land and the labor that's been taken away from people. And you're gathering those things together in a tradable form. The distinction between money and capital, or currency and capital, is that capital reproduces itself. So you're not engaged in land ownership or extraction of the physical land. So you're not mining or timbering or selling water, something like that. And you're not actually laboring. So you're not transforming any of those things I just said into usable products. If you just have, you already have the money, then the money recreates itself. The money can just recreate itself. That is a new feature of economic systems. That is essentially what capitalism is. So it enables people to not work, and enables people to not interface with the land, and to generate obscene amounts of money. I'll just leave it at that. And then the land and the water. So I think this one kind of thinking about an eco-spiritual view of the land, similar to the kinship-based commons, and really inviting just to reflect on what is you and your family's relationship to the land, and what does the land mean to you? What does the land mean to us collectively as well? And then the next one, this isn't lifted up as much as I think it could be, but when we're talking about Black land retention and Black agrarianism, we really have to talk about tribal land sovereignty and how to negotiate efforts to stop Black land loss, and efforts to revitalize Black land ownership in the United States with tribal land sovereignty, and the fact that the United States government appropriated about 99% of the land base that is now in the United States from tribal nations. And what does it mean to own that land that was expropriated, and to restrict access to that land via ownership? And these 3 points here, I just want to lift up because I think they're pretty important. There's not a stark as I'm sure many of us know, is not a stark dividing line between who is Black and who is Native. I just put a cool book that I really like there. That's an anthology exploring Black and Native lives in the Americas. And then also just what do our ancestral traditions have to say about the rights of the first occupants of the land, of the first peoples of the land? Like what, in terms of like traditional religion or traditional governance within West Central Africa, what do they have to say about the first people of a place? Like what rights do they have? And how to be in relation with them? And also like historically, presently, and in the future, how would efforts to increase Black land ownership, like could that actually support the further dispossession of tribal nations from the land? Or at the same time, like, are there ways in which we could support tribal land sovereignty and kind of disrupt the project of genocide that's ongoing in tribal communities and tribal nations? And to bring it full circle, strategies for revitalizing Black agrarianism itself. So kind of how do we stabilize the body, the cultural body that we have, and how do we bring it back to life? These are kind of the four that were identified through the course of the interviews. So of course, from the beginning, it's always recrafting the kinship-based commons. So we're utilizing strategies to protect air property because air property is actually the original, it's the only survival of the kinship-based commons. A lot of folk talk about, oh, well, you know, so-and-so great-great-granddad didn't write a will because he didn't trust the government, blah, blah, blah. He didn't trust, lawyers, the law. Absolutely, completely true. But there is a precedent for not writing wills. In the kinship-based commons, there were no wills written. There were not oral wills and there were not written wills oftentimes. Because the land stayed in the lineage, and it is the lineage and the family's duty to figure out how to manage the land. Obviously, we are in an immensely antagonistic and violent condition as Black people in the United States that, this is why air property is being stripped away from Black families. But I continue. So in addition to recrafting kinship-based commons or continuing to do so, forming cooperatively owned and governed land bases and enterprises, extend relationship and kinship beyond practices of exclusion. So that's a little wordy, but basically saying that like land ownership as it's designed today, it's all about, it rests on legally on the concept of exclusion. So being able to exclude any and all humans from a boundaried piece of the earth. And what I'm saying is that is not proper, it is not respectful, and in many cases, obviously that can be necessary when we're talking about white violence. But again, this kind of harkens back to tribal land sovereignty. And then the next strategy is continue technologies for connection conjures. So that's kind of remembering, reclaiming, and revising our story. So for example, in the reviewing the Great Migration, right, as a forced flight from the land that was coerced, in which people left home and lived away from home with a deep longing for home. People went back to the home place whenever they could, and then the home place was lost. So really just instead of a choice to flee this horrible life of the South, it's a mixture of the two. And really working the land. I mean, working the ground and working in the soil in a lot of ways will reignite the memory and reignite what it feels like in relationship to the land that so many of our ancestors had. And that's what I mean when I say facilitate revelatory experiences. Understand and address domination and extraction. So this is really about just figuring out how to outmaneuver and defend land from seizure. And understand that we're actually, and deepen our understanding that we do live in a very antagonistic society to Black land ownership, to Black sovereignty, and to Black community, and to really position ourselves to defend ourselves as best we possibly can from many avenues. And lastly, but not least, is closing the generational rift. I think this is one of the most important things of really bringing together a mix of holders and seekers. So the holders being elders, the seekers being young folk, and pass on story lineage of the lineages of local ecologies. Like, what is this land meant to the people who were here before you, and how is that connected to you? How's it connected to us? And pass on folk memories. A lot of folk memories are actually really, really relevant to how to survive on the land. That one of the things I encountered in my interviews, oftentimes, and not even just in interviews, just talking to elders, was this constant, I've heard this from at least a dozen elders. We only went to the store for salt and pepper. I mean, can you imagine living like, it's incredible. And to take care of the land and to farm with an understanding that that's the way that folk could do is incredible, and it's a source of inspiration for how to continue within these really extreme conditions that we are under and that we're going to continue to see. So kind of in closing, just want to bring forward some highlights and takeaways. I'm not going to read it verbatim because this will be shared, presentation will be shared. But basically, SAAFON stewards Black agrarianism in a unique way. And that Black agrarianism is an ancestral inheritance. It's a tradition that's centered on reverence for the land and the practice of kinship. And it's been passed down to us over the generations for our sake and for the yet to be born, our children and our communities, children, our family. And we have a duty to pass it on. And Black agrarianism, as I've been saying, exists in a very antagonistic system of power. White supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism has sought to destroy the elements of Black agrarianism that are antagonistic. And this has created a lot of trauma and lateral violence, internalized anti-blackness. And last but not least, Black agrarianism is our future. We must carry on and innovate upon Black agrarianism because it is the key to our survival on the land in the future as political conditions worsen, as climate change worsens. Like, Black agrarianism is the key to unlocking our adaptation to the future, and it's the key to unlocking our continued survival in this place that is called North America. I just want to close with this quote from Miss Ursine Evans, a SAAFON member. I was raised by my grandmother, and because of what she taught me, it convinced me to come back home and live on the land. Because of her, I had something to come home to. Beautiful. So this is what I'm inviting at the end, either for Q&A or just for yourself personally, want to journal or talk with friends, colleagues, and family. What's next for revitalizing Black agrarianism? Based on this presentation, Like, what do you want to do? But yeah, that's it. I appreciate y'all for attending and listening, and I hope that it was um, generative and easy to follow and full of learning. Appreciate y'all so much. Peace.